They offered him gold enough to buy the whole town, and he said no. Now before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your town or your state, because stories like this travel farther than any horse ever could. And this one begins with a sound that carried through dry air like a verdict, a heavy pouch hitting old wood, coins shifting inside like something restless, the kind of weight men measure their lives against. And every eye in that narrow saloon turned toward it at once, because in a place like Red Hollow, gold didn't just mean money. It meant power. It meant escape. It meant a man could finally stop waking up with dust in his throat and worry in his bones. But Caleb Ward didn't move. Not when the pouch hit. Not when the coins settled. Not even when the murmurs started rising like wind before a storm. He just stood there at the end of the table, hat low, hands loose at his sides, looking like a man who had already made up his mind long before the offer ever reached him. And across from him stood Ayanna, still as stone, her dark eyes steady, not pleading, not demanding, just watching, like she wasn't offering gold at all, but something far heavier, something that couldn't be counted or spent. "It's yours," she said, her voice calm, carrying through the room without needing to be loud. "For the box." And that's when the laughter started, low at first, then sharper, spreading from one table to the next, because the box sat there between them. Small, worn, barely worth a second glance, the kind of thing a man might trade for a drink and forget by morning. Cracked wood, faded edges, nothing inside that anyone could see. And yet that was what she wanted, not land, not cattle, not protection, just that box. And Caleb finally looked down at it, just once, like he was weighing something no one else could see, then back at her. And in that moment the whole room leaned forward, because every man there knew what choice he was supposed to make. Gold was gold, and a man who turned it down was either a fool or something worse. "Take it," someone muttered, nudging the pouch closer with his boot, coins shifting again, catching the lamplight in flashes. That made the air feel tight, but Caleb shook his head slow, almost tired, like this wasn't a hard decision at all. "I don't take what isn't mine," he said, and the words didn't sound loud, but they cut through everything. The laughter paused, just for a second, like the room itself didn't quite understand what it had heard. Then it came back louder, harsher, men slapping tables, shaking their heads, calling him names that stuck easy in a place like that. A fool, a man too proud for his own good, a man who didn't understand how the world worked. But Ayanna didn't laugh. She stepped closer instead, just one step, and something in the air shifted with it, subtle, almost invisible, but enough that a few men near the door straightened without knowing why. "You refuse?" she asked, softer now, and Caleb met her eyes without hesitation. No anger, no fear, just something steady, something that didn't bend easy. "I refuse," he said, and for a moment nothing moved, not the smoke, not the men, not even the coins that had finally gone still inside that pouch. Then someone scoffed and kicked the gold again, sending it sliding across the table. "Then leave it," he said. "Someone here's got sense." More laughter, louder this time, filling the room, drowning out whatever had just passed between Caleb and the woman. But outside, beyond the wooden walls and the noise and the easy judgment of men who had never been tested the way they thought they had, the wind carried something else. Across the open land, something distant, something quiet, the kind of sound that didn't rush or shout, just kept coming, steady, patient, like it had all the time in the world. And back inside, Caleb reached for the box, not the gold, his fingers brushing the worn wood like he understood its weight in a way no one else did. And as he lifted it, Ayanna's gaze didn't leave him, not even for a second, like she had been waiting for that exact moment all along. And somewhere far beyond the edge of town, the dust began to rise, though no storm had been called for that day. Caleb stepped out of the saloon with the box in his hand, and the laughter still following him like dust clinging to boots. But it did not reach his eyes, and it did not change his pace. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the single street of Red Hollow, and every boardwalk creak seemed louder than it should have been, as if the town itself was listening. He paused just once at the edge of the porch, not to look back at the gold, but to turn the box slightly in his hands, feeling the weight of it. Not heavy in the way coins were heavy, but steady, deliberate, like something that had chosen to be carried. The wood was worn smooth in places and rough in others, and there was a faint marking along the lid, something carved long ago and nearly erased by time. Caleb traced it with his thumb without thinking, a habit more than a choice. And across the street a pair of men leaned against a post watching him with the same half-smile that comes easy when a man has just made himself a story. "You forgot your fortune," one of them called out. But Caleb did not answer. He stepped down into the dust and began walking toward the far end of town where the buildings thinned and the land opened up into miles of dry grass and scattered rock, the kind of land that did not belong to anyone no matter how many deeds were signed in town offices. Behind him the saloon doors swung once, then settled, and the noise faded, replaced by something quieter, something that settled in the space between sounds, the kind of silence that comes before a change. Ayanna followed at a distance, at first her steps measured, her presence neither hidden nor announced, and when she spoke her voice carried just enough to reach him without needing to raise it. "You did not even ask what was inside," she said. Caleb slowed but did not stop. "I did not need to," he replied. Simple as that. She came closer, then close enough that the dust from her steps mixed with his, and for a moment they walked side by side without speaking, the town behind them shrinking with each step. Most men would have taken the gold and never looked back, she said, not as a question but as a truth she had seen too many times. Caleb nodded once. "Most men are afraid of what they cannot measure," he said, and there was no pride in it, only fact. Ayanna studied him then in a way that was not obvious but precise, like she was fitting pieces together that had been scattered for years. "And you are not afraid," she said. Caleb let out a breath that might have been a quiet laugh, or might have been something older. "Everyone is afraid," he said. "Some just choose what they are afraid of." They walked another 20 yards before he stopped near an old hitching post that no longer held any horses. The wood cracked and leaning, much like the town itself. He turned the box over in his hands again, then finally looked at her directly. "This was never about the gold," he said. Ayanna shook her head slightly. "No," she answered, and for the first time there was something like relief in her voice, small but real. "It was not." The wind picked up just then, carrying a thin line of dust across the road, and with it a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for imagination. A distant rhythm, steady, measured, not hurried. Caleb's gaze shifted past her toward the horizon where the land met the sky in a pale line. He did not react the way most men would have. No sudden movement, no tension in his shoulders, just a quiet stillness as if he had been expecting something like this all along. "They are early," Ayanna said softly, almost to herself. Caleb glanced back at her. "You knew they were coming," he said, not accusing, just placing another piece where it belonged. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "I needed to know if you would choose the same thing without them here," she said. Caleb looked down at the box again, and the faint marking along its lid seemed to catch the light for just a second longer than it should have. "And now you know," he said. Ayanna's expression did not change much, but something in her posture eased, something that had been held tight now released. "Yes," she said, and the word carried more weight than the gold ever could. Behind them a door slammed somewhere in town, and a voice called out, sharp with confusion. Another answered, then another, the kind of sound that spreads when people begin to notice something they cannot explain. Caleb turned slightly toward the noise, then back to the horizon. The rhythm was clearer now, not loud, but undeniable. Many hooves moving as one, not rushing, not threatening, just arriving. And the dust line grew thicker, rising slow and wide like a curtain being pulled back. Ayanna stepped past him, then turning to face the town instead of the open land, her back straight, her chin level. And for the first time since she had entered Red Hollow, she looked exactly like what she was, not a stranger, not a visitor, but someone who belonged to something far larger than any one place. Caleb remained where he stood, the box steady in his hands as the first shapes began to form within the dust, distant still but unmistakable, and somewhere behind them the laughter that had once filled the street did not return. The dust did not rush the town. It arrived, slow and certain, spreading across the horizon like something that had been waiting its turn, and the sound of hooves settled into a steady rhythm that no one could mistake now. Not one rider, not a handful, but many, enough that men on the boardwalks began to stand without realizing they had moved, hands resting near belts, not out of courage but out of habit. because habit was all they had left when something larger than them stepped into view. Caleb did not shift his weight, did not tighten his grip on the box. He simply watched, the way a man watches the weather when he knows it will not change for him. Beside him, Ayana stood facing the town, her back straight, her presence quiet but unyielding. And for the first time, the distance between her and the people of Red Hollow was not measured in steps, but in understanding. The first riders appeared through the thinning dust, shapes becoming men, outlines sharpening into detail, horses moving at a walk, not fast, not slow, each step placed with intention. They did not spread out. They did not circle. They came forward in a single line that widened as more emerged behind them. Dozens, then more, enough that the edge of town seemed too small to hold what was arriving. A door creaked open behind Caleb, and someone stepped out onto the street. Then another, voices low now, no. Laughter laughed. Only questions that no one wanted to ask out loud. What is this? One man whispered, but no one answered him, because the answer was already in front of them. The riders stopped just short of the first building, not crossing into the town, not claiming it, simply present, their stillness more powerful than any motion could have been. And in that stillness there was no anger, no threat, only a kind of quiet that made men lower their eyes without knowing why. Caleb glanced once at Ayana, and she gave the smallest nod, as if something long decided had finally reached its moment. She stepped forward then, one pace into the open space between the town and the riders, and when she spoke, her voice carried across the distance, clear and steady. You judged a man by what he refused, she said, and the words settled over the street like dust. No one interrupted her. No one laughed now. But you did not ask why. A man near the saloon shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down at the ground as if it might offer him an answer. Ayana turned slightly, her gaze moving across the faces, not accusing, not harsh, just seeing them as they were. He chose not to take what was not his, she continued, and that choice was seen. Behind her, one of the riders dismounted, then another, not quickly, not as a signal, simply as a continuation of something understood among them. They stood beside their horses, heads bowed just enough to show respect without surrender, and that small motion carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Caleb felt the box shift slightly in his hands, not moving on its own but settling, as if it recognized where it belonged. He lifted the lid then, slowly, not for the town, but because the moment had come. Inside there was no gold, no hidden fortune, only a folded piece of cloth wrapped around something small, something that had been protected for a long time. He unwrapped it with careful hands, revealing a simple carving, a symbol, etched into stone, worn but unmistakable. Ayana turned back toward him, and for the first time there was something in her eyes that had not been there before, something close to relief. My father carried that, she said quietly, and though her voice was soft, it carried, before he gave it to a man who saved his life when no one was watching. A murmur moved through the town, not loud but present, a shift in understanding that came too late to stop what had already been set in motion. Caleb closed his hand around the carving then and looked out at the men who had laughed at him only hours before, his expression unchanged, no anger, no triumph, just the same steady calm that had been there from the start. Gold does not make something yours, he said, not raising his voice, not needing to, choice does. And the words landed heavier than the pouch that still sat back on the table inside the saloon, untouched, unwanted now. Behind Ayana, the riders remained still, their presence filling the space with a quiet certainty. And one by one the men of Red Hollow began to understand that what they had witnessed was not a mistake, not foolishness, but something they had not recognized because they had never chosen it themselves. And in that realization the town grew smaller, not in size but in certainty, as if the ground beneath it had shifted just enough to remind them it was never as solid as they believed. The town did not speak right away because some truths arrive without noise and take hold before a man can find the words to push them back. And Red Hollow stood there, caught between what it had always believed and what now stood in front of it, unmoving, undeniable. Caleb lowered his hand slightly, the carving still resting in his palm, as if it had weight beyond stone. And the wind passed once through the street, lifting dust in a thin line that drifted between boots and boards without settling, as though even the ground was unsure where to rest. A man near the saloon cleared his throat like he meant to say something bold, but the sound died before it formed into words. Another shifted his stance, glancing from the riders to Caleb and back again, measuring something he had never measured before. Not distance, not numbers, but meaning. Iana stepped back beside Caleb, now no longer between two worlds, but standing with quiet certainty in one. Her eyes moved across the men who had laughed earlier, and though she said nothing more, the silence she left behind carried enough. The riders remained where they were, not advancing, not retreating, simply present in a way that asked nothing and yet changed everything. One of them, an older man with silver woven through his hair, took a step forward and inclined his head toward Caleb. Not deeply, not dramatically, just enough to be seen, just enough to be understood. And in that small motion, something inside the town gave way, not loudly, not all at once, but piece by piece, like dry wood settling under new weight. Caleb closed his fingers around the carving, and for a moment his gaze dropped to it, the worn edges, the marks left by hands long gone. Then he lifted his eyes again, not toward the riders, not toward Iana, but toward the town itself. The same men who had offered him laughter in place of respect. And there was no accusation in his look, no satisfaction either. Only the same quiet steadiness that had guided him from the beginning. He reached into his coat, then, and drew out a small cloth wrapping, the kind used for carrying something that mattered. And without ceremony, he placed the carving back inside the box, folding the cloth over it with care before closing the lid. The sound of wood meeting wood was soft, but it carried a final note to something that did not need repeating. He turned then, not toward the saloon, not toward the gold still lying where it had been pushed and ignored, but toward the open land beyond the town, the same direction the riders had come from. Iana watched him for a moment longer, as if committing something to memory, then she inclined her head just slightly. Not as a command, not as a farewell, but as recognition. Caleb stepped forward, passing the old hitching post without looking at it, and continued on into the dust, his pace unhurried, his path clear. The riders did not follow him. They did not need to. Instead, they remained where they were for a few moments more, long enough for the town to feel the full weight of what had happened. Then one by one they turned their horses, not in retreat, but in completion, as if a task had been fulfilled, hooves pressing into the earth. With the same steady rhythm that had brought them, the sound receding not quickly but gradually until it blended back into the quiet of the land, leaving Red Hollow standing alone again, but not unchanged, not untouched. A door creaked open somewhere, and a man stepped into the street, looking toward the place where Caleb had disappeared. His mouth opened as if to call out, but no name came. Because some men leave without taking anything and still manage to carry something away, and others stay, surrounded by everything they thought mattered, only to realize it weighs less than the choice they refused to make. Inside the saloon, the pouch of gold still sat on the table, the coins dull now in the morning light. No one reached for it. Not because it had lost its value, but because something else had been seen that made it smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. And outside, the wind moved once more across the empty road, lifting a thin line of dust that traced the path Caleb had taken before, fading into the wide, open land beyond. The town did not return to what it had been, because once a man sees something, he cannot unsee it. And Red Hollow carried that quiet weight into the next morning, the kind that settled behind the eyes and stayed there even when no one spoke of it. The sun rose the same way it always did, burning pale gold over the rooftops and stretching long shadows across the empty street. But the air felt different, thinner somehow, like something had been taken from it, or maybe something had been revealed that could not be put back. Inside the saloon, the pouch of gold still sat on the table exactly where it had been left. No one had touched it through the night, not even the ones who would have fought over a single coin the day before. A man stepped in, slowly glancing at it, then away, like it no longer belonged to him or to anyone else. He reached out once, then stopped, his hand hovering above the leather before pulling it back, as if he had remembered something too late. Outside, a pair of men stood near the hitching post, speaking in low voices that never quite formed into confidence. He just walked away. One said, not asking. The other nodded but did not answer right away, his eyes fixed on the road that led out of town. Some men do, he finally replied, though it sounded less like agreement and more like uncertainty. Iana remained at the edge of the street where she had stood the day before, her presence calm, her gaze following the same line into the distance. She had not left with the riders. And that alone was enough to unsettle the town further because it meant whatever had happened was not finished. A boy passed by carrying a bucket of water and slowed when he saw her. Not out of fear, but out of something else, something closer to curiosity. He looked at her, then down at the ground before hurrying on. The town watched her, without staring the way people do when they are unsure what they are allowed to understand. And through it all the wind moved in soft currents, brushing dust across the road in thin lines that came and went without settling. Caleb had not looked back when he left, and yet his absence felt larger than his presence ever had, because now it carried meaning. Not just a man walking away, but a choice that remained behind. Iana stepped forward after a long while, not toward the saloon, not toward the gold, but toward the center of the street. Her footsteps quiet but steady, and when she spoke she did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You thought he lost something," she said, and a few men shifted where they stood. But he did not. She paused, letting the words rest before continuing. "He left you with something instead." A man near the porch frowned slightly, as if trying to grasp what could be left behind by someone who took nothing. "What would that be?" he asked, not with challenge, but with confusion. Iana looked at him, then at the others, her gaze steady. "The chance to choose again," she said simply, and there was no weight of judgment in her tone, only truth, the kind that does not press but waits. Silence followed, not empty but full, as if each man held something he had not expected to carry. The wind shifted again, and for a moment it sounded almost like distant movement. But there were no riders now, only the echo of what had passed inside the saloon. The gold remained untouched, its shine dulled not by time, but by comparison. Because once a man has seen something that cannot be bought, he begins to understand the limits of what can. And outside the town stood, as it always had, buildings, weathered boards, worn paths etched into the dirt. But beneath it all something had shifted, small and quiet, but real. And far out beyond the last fence post, where the land stretched wide and open, a lone figure moved steadily along the horizon. Not hurried, not lost, just moving forward with the same calm certainty that had brought him to the moment they would remember long after the gold was spent and forgotten. And back in Red Hollow no one laughed that morning. Not because they were told not to, but because the sound no longer fit the shape of what they had seen. By the time the sun climbed higher over Red Hollow, the stillness had not lifted. It had settled deeper into the boards, into the dust, into the way men moved slower than they had the day before, as if each step carried a thought they had not yet finished. The gold still sat untouched inside the saloon, but now it felt less like an offer and more like a question no one wanted to answer. Outside, Iana remained where the road widened into open space, her eyes fixed not on the town, but beyond it. Toward the same horizon Caleb had chosen without hesitation. A man approached her carefully, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. The kind that comes when a person realizes the world is larger than what he has understood so far. He removed his hat slowly, holding it in his hands, as if that small gesture might help him find the right words. "Why did he take the box?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Iana did not turn immediately, and when she did, her gaze did not challenge him. It simply met him where he stood. "Because he recognized it," she said, and the man frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in confusion. "Recognized what?" he asked, and she let the silence stretch just long enough for the wind to pass between them before answering. "Something that cannot be traded," she said, and the words did not explain. They revealed. The man nodded slowly, though it was clear he did not fully understand. Not yet. But something in him had shifted enough to know that he wanted to. Nearby, another man stepped out from the saloon, holding the pouch of gold in both hands, as if unsure what to do with it. He looked around, waiting for someone to claim it, to laugh, to restore the world to what it had been. But no one spoke. No one stepped forward. The pouch seemed heavier now, not because of its contents, but because of what it represented. A choice already made and a chance already missed. He set it back down on the table with care this time, not like before, not like a temptation, but like something that had lost its place. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the faint echo of hooves long gone, but not forgotten. And far out beyond the last line of buildings, a lone figure moved steadily across the land. Caleb did not hurry. He did not look back. The box rested securely in his grasp, its presence quiet but certain. He had not opened it again because he did not need to. Some things are understood the moment they are chosen and do not require repeating. The land stretched wide before him, miles of dry grass broken by rock and low hills, the kind of place where a man learns quickly what matters and what does not. Behind him the town began to move again, but not in the same way. A woman swept the front of her porch more slowly than usual, pausing now and then to glance toward the road. A boy carried water with careful steps, as if the ground might shift beneath him if he rushed, and the men who had once laughed found themselves speaking less and listening more, not because they had been told to, but because something inside them had changed direction. Ayana finally turned away from the horizon and began walking through the town, her steps quiet, her presence no longer questioned, but not fully understood either. She paused at the doorway of the saloon, looking in at the gold resting where it had been left. Her gaze lingered for a moment, then moved on. She did not touch it. She did not need to. Outside, she continued walking until she reached the far edge where the road met open land, and there she stopped once more. The wind lifted a thin line of dust that followed Caleb's path for a few yards before fading. And in that moment it became clear that what had passed through Red Hollow had not been a transaction, not even a test in the way the town might have named it. It had been a mirror, held up quietly, without force, showing each person what they valued when no one was watching, and what they chose when something greater stood before them. Ayana closed her eyes briefly as if marking the end of something unseen, then opened them again, calm as before, and turned away from the town, because some lessons are not meant to be explained, only witnessed. And far ahead Caleb continued on, carrying nothing the town could measure, and yet leaving behind more than any man there had ever offered. The road stretched ahead in long, quiet miles, and Caleb did not measure them by distance, but by the sound of his own steps settling into the rhythm of the land, the kind of rhythm a man learns when he has stopped trying to outrun anything. The box rested against his side, steady with each movement, and though it was small, it seemed to carry a presence that matched the open sky above him. Not heavy, not demanding, just certain. The sun climbed higher, warming the dry grass, until the air shimmered slightly at the edges of the horizon, and still he did not slow. Behind him Red Hollow had already begun to fade into something less solid, not in shape, but in meaning. The voices, the laughter, the doubt, they all seemed smaller now, like echoes that belonged to another time. Ahead a line of low hills rose, gentle but firm, and Caleb angled his path toward them without hesitation, not because he knew what waited there, but because he did not need to. Some directions are chosen once and then followed without question. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint scent of earth and something older, something that did not belong to towns or trade or gold. He paused for the first time since leaving the edge of town, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, the kind that comes when a place recognizes a man before he recognizes it. He looked down at the box, then turning it slightly in his hands, and for a moment he lifted the lid just enough to see the cloth inside. Not to check, not to confirm, but simply to acknowledge. The carving remained wrapped exactly as before, untouched by time or movement, and he closed the lid again with the same quiet care. "You carry it well," a voice said from behind him, calm and familiar. Caleb did not turn immediately. He did not need to. He had known she would come. Ayana stepped into view beside him, her presence as steady as it had been in the town, but different now, lighter in a way that came from something resolved. "It was never mine," Caleb replied, and there was no false humility in it, only truth. Ayana nodded once, her gaze moving across the land ahead. "That is why it chose you," she said, and the words settled between them without needing explanation. They stood there for a moment, not as strangers, not as allies, but as two people who understood the same thing from different paths. The wind passed again, lifting dust around their boots before carrying it forward into the open distance. "They will remember," Ayana said after a while, her voice quiet but certain. Caleb let out a breath, slow and even. "Not all of them," he answered, "but enough." And that seemed to be enough for both of them. She stepped ahead of him, then moving toward the low hills, her pace unhurried, her direction clear. Caleb followed without question, not because he was led, but because the path aligned with something already decided. The land shifted gradually as they walked, the dry grass giving way to patches of stone and scattered brush, the air cooling slightly as the ground rose beneath them. Far behind, the town continued its quiet transformation, though neither of them looked back. In Red Hollow the gold remained untouched, not abandoned, but redefined. A few men had begun to speak of it differently, not as wealth, but as weight. Something that could be held but not understood in the same way anymore. A boy stood outside the saloon. Doorway, staring at the pouch as if it might explain something if he looked long enough. But it did not, because the answer had never been in the gold. It had been in the choice, and that choice now walked far beyond the reach of the town. Back on the open land, Caleb and Ayanna reached the crest of the first hill and paused. The view beyond stretched wide and unbroken, a vast expanse that held no boundaries, no claims, only distance and possibility. Caleb rested his hand lightly on the box, not gripping it, not guarding it, just acknowledging its place. What happens now? He asked, not because he needed direction, but because the moment invited the question. Ayanna looked out over the land, her expression calm, her voice steady. Now it is returned, she said. And though she did not point, Caleb understood. The path ahead was not about keeping or gaining, it was about placing something back where it belonged. Not in a town, not in a trade, but in something larger, something that did not measure worth by weight or shine. The wind moved once more across the hilltop, carrying with it the quiet certainty that had followed them since the beginning. And together they stepped forward into the open land where no one waited to judge and nothing needed to be proven, only chosen. The land did not rush to meet them. It unfolded slowly, as if revealing itself only to those who walked without asking for more than what was already there. Caleb and Ayanna moved along the ridge where the wind carried fewer traces of the town and more of something older, something that did not belong to names or ownership. The hills rose and fell in long, quiet lines, and the sky stretched wide above them, untouched by the noise that had once filled Red Hollow. Caleb felt the shift without needing to name it. The way the ground beneath his boots seemed steadier, not because it was easier, but because it did not pretend to be anything else. The box remained in his hands, and though he had carried it miles now, it did not feel like a burden. It felt like a direction. Ayanna slowed her pace as they approached a narrow pass between two weathered rock formations, the kind shaped by time rather than force. She stepped through first, her hand brushing lightly against the stone as if acknowledging it. Caleb followed, and as he crossed into the space beyond, the air changed subtly, cooler, quieter, like a place that held memory without needing to speak it. A small clearing opened before them, ringed by low stone and scattered with patches of grass that had found a way to grow where little else could. At the center stood a single upright rock, worn smooth by years of wind and weather, not marked by any tool, but shaped by presence alone. Ayanna stopped there, her posture straight, her expression calm. "This is where it returns," she said, her voice soft, but carrying the same certainty it always had. Caleb stepped closer, looking at the stone, then down at the box in his hands. He did not ask why. He did not need to. Some places answer questions before they are spoken. He knelt slowly, not as a ritual, not as a gesture for anyone else, but because it felt right. The ground beneath him firm and unyielding in a way that felt honest. He set the box down before him and rested his hand on its lid for a moment, not holding on, just pausing. Then he opened it. The cloth inside remained folded exactly as before, and when he unwrapped it, the carving caught the light in a way that seemed quieter here, less like something to be seen and more like something to be understood. He held it for a moment longer, feeling its edges, its shape, the way it fit into his palm, as if it had always belonged there, and then he placed it at the base of the stone. Not carefully, not ceremonially, just with the same steady motion that had guided him from the beginning. Ayanna stepped forward then and stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the carving now, resting where it had been meant to return. Neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently through the clearing, brushing the grass and passing over the stone without resistance. And in that quiet, something shifted, not around them, but within the moment itself, like a circle closing without sound. Caleb rose slowly, his hands now empty, but not lacking. He looked once more at the carving, then stepped back. Ayanna nodded once, a small movement, but enough to mark the end of something unseen. "It is done," she said, and the words did not carry relief or finality, only truth. They stood there a moment longer, letting the silence settle into place before turning away. The path back was not the same as the path, and not because it had changed, but because they had. Caleb did not look back at the stone, and neither did Ayanna. Not out of disregard, but because what had been returned no longer needed watching. As they walked, the wind picked up slightly, carrying the faintest trace of distant sound, Not hooves, not voices, just the open land breathing as it always had. Far behind them, Red Hollow continued its slow, quiet shift. Men who once measured worth in weight and shine now found themselves pausing before speaking, thinking before reaching. Not all of them, not completely, but enough that something had begun. And though the gold still rested where it had been left, its meaning no longer held the same ground. Back in the clearing, the carving remained at the base of the stone, unmoving, unnoticed by anyone who had not been there, and yet exactly where it needed to be. And as the sun began its slow descent, casting longer shadows across the hills, Caleb and Ayanna continued forward, not toward a destination, not toward a reward, but simply along a path that no longer required explanation. Because some choices do not end when they are made. They continue, quietly shaping everything that follows. The sun had begun its slow descent when Caleb and Ayanna reached the far side of the ridge, the light stretching long across the land in quiet gold that did not glitter the way coins did, but settled into everything it touched, honest and unchanging. They walked without speaking, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the moment no longer required words, the kind of silence that follows when something has been completed the right way, not loudly, not dramatically, but exactly as it was meant to be. Caleb's hands felt lighter now, not empty but free, as if the weight he had carried was never meant to stay with him beyond the moment of choosing. He glanced once at the horizon, then at Ayanna walking beside him, her steps steady, her presence calm. And there was something different now, not in her, but in the space between them. No longer a question, no longer a test, just understanding. Will they change? Caleb asked after a while, his voice low, carried by the wind, but not lost in it. Ayanna did not answer immediately. She looked back once toward the distant line where the town could no longer be seen, only imagined. Then forward again. Some will, she said. Others will remember and forget at the same time. Caleb nodded slightly, as if that answer had been expected, because change was not something a man could hand to another like gold or trade for like land. It had to be chosen, the same way he had chosen without knowing who would see it or what it would bring. The wind moved across the hills again, softer, now carrying no dust, no echo of hooves, only the quiet breath of open land. Far behind them, Red Hollow continued in its own way. The gold still rested where it had been left, but its meaning had thinned. A man finally picked it up that afternoon, not with excitement, not with hunger, but with hesitation. He turned the pouch in his hands as if expecting it to speak, but it did not. It only remained what it had always been, and he set it back down. Again, not out of fear, but because he no longer knew what it was worth. A boy stood nearby watching him, and for a moment their eyes met, and something passed between them that had not been there before. Not knowledge, not agreement, just the beginning of a question that might take years to answer. Back on the open land, Caleb and Ayanna reached a fork where the path split in two directions, one leading toward distant mountains barely visible in the fading light, the other toward lower ground where the land stretched flat and wide. Ayanna slowed, then stopping at the divide. "This is where our paths part," she said, her voice calm, not heavy. Caleb looked at the two directions, then back at her. "You knew this too," he said. Not as a question, she nodded once. "From the beginning," she answered. There was no regret in it, no sense of loss, only the same quiet certainty that had guided everything that came before. Caleb adjusted his stance, the wind brushing lightly against his coat. "Then I will keep walking," he said, and Ayanna's lips curved just slightly, not into a smile, but into something close to it. "That is what you do," she replied. They stood there for a moment longer, not needing to say more. Then Ayanna turned and took the path toward the lower land, her figure moving steadily away until it became part of the distance itself. Caleb watched her go for a few seconds, then turned toward the mountains and began walking again, his pace unchanged, his direction clear. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched ahead of him like quiet companions. And as the light softened, the land seemed to open even more, as if acknowledging a choice made without witness and carried without pride. No one in Red Hollow would see where he went next, no one would follow his steps or measure the distance he covered. But the choice he had made would remain behind, not as a story to be told loudly, but as something quieter, something that would surface in moments when a man stood at his own table with something offered and something unspoken resting beside it, and long after the gold had been spent or forgotten, the memory of a man who refused it without Hesitation would linger not as a legend, but as a question, simple and unrelenting. What would you choose when no one could force your hand? And out there beyond the reach of any town, Caleb Ward walked on, not toward recognition, not toward reward, but toward a horizon that did not promise anything except the chance to choose again. And in that quiet, endless space, that was more than enough.